welcome to Law Matters. Thank you. Today's guest, we're very pleased to welcome Jonathan Caplan, now KC, formerly QC, who's on many occasions represented the defendants who seek his services in Hong Kong and, of course, from time to time, the prosecution. Jonathan, welcome.
Thank you. It's wonderful to see you here again. And the last time we met, you recall we spoke about national security law and its implications for practitioners and so on. And I wanted, Haldanes wanted really to find a topic that was of general interest and has an impact. And I think that interest, continuing interest, albeit that we don't really have a Me Too movement problem in Hong Kong, at least not yet, is the idea that's arisen around the world that there are investigations into various people, sometimes with big reputations. And before anyone's actually, anyone's necessarily arrested or charged or indeed convicted, the press gets hold of it and there's a feeding frenzy. And that's caused, I know, a lot of anxiety to a lot of people. Yes.
And has been debated both in America and in England and other parts of the world. Your views?
Well, I do think this is a very serious problem which needs to be redressed. And it's one of those problems where you have a very vocal minority and a lot of people are cautious about expressing their views. And if you're not careful, it can lead to a large amount of injustice in many cases. So if we begin, for example, with...
Can I just stop you? So what you're really saying there, I think, just to be clear, is that there are those that have had an offence committed against them and they need to be able to speak out? Is that the point?
No. I'm certainly saying... let me put it this way. Yes, to the extent that, let's focus on women, for example, hitherto have felt that they haven't been able to speak out and report sexual crimes against them because either they feared they wouldn't be believed or they feared the consequences of doing so. That clearly needs to be redressed, there's no doubt about that. And I think people generally feel, I hope, more comfortable in coming forward. Police have been retrained to listen to them and not to discount necessarily at first blush what they say.
So just pausing, what we're saying there, because there's a concept for those that are not lawyers, of a recent complaint, is that the right expression? You're expected, if somebody commits a crime against you, particularly a sexual one, it's thought that if you don't report it quite quickly, that it diminishes in its efficacy.
Yes, and why haven't you spoken about this earlier? And of course there's always a consequence to that. If you don't speak about it for years, it is unfair on the person whom you are accusing because it's often less easy for them to defend themselves and find witnesses to counter the allegation.
Yeah.
So that began the very well-known international movement, Me Too, and that has encouraged women around the world to come forward and to voice complaints which they might otherwise never have done, and to expose people who are, let's say, sex pests. Now there's a contrary side to that in my view, and that is that I agree people should be able to come forward. I do not agree that they should properly do so by simply speaking to the press and or holding a press conference, because the consequence of that is that somebody is simply named, and the consequence of being named is that their career very likely is simply cancelled, and this case may never go to court, it may never be tried, and simply left hanging there is a rather nasty allegation against an individual which has never properly been tested. And there are many, many examples of people's careers being brought to a swift and possibly unjust end by the complainant not going to the police or not instituting civil proceedings.
So you might argue, of course, on the other side of the other toss of the coin is, well, if it's defamation law to take care of that.
Yes, you could do that, of course, then you've got to have the money to commence defamation proceedings. This really has really given rise to a number of highly publicised cases and a very interesting campaign now to amend the law so that people should not receive publicity if they are arrested unless and until they are charged. But let me set the context for that. One of the people who was accused of sexual offences was the well-known singer Cliff Richard. And what happened there was, surprisingly, the BBC, who were working in conjunction with the police, filmed the raid on his flat in the United Kingdom. Cliff Richard was abroad and watched, to his horror, on television his flat being raided, as did many other people. And out to the wider world goes the allegation Cliff Richard is arrested for sexual offences on a young boy or boys.
Actually, just pausing there for a moment, it was worse than that in the Cliff Richard case, because what you've said is absolutely accurate. There were sort of helicopters in the air and cameras shooting into his front room, as it were, and the police looking for copies of the young ones, perhaps. And in fact, he wasn't even arrested.
No, this was simply a search.
Yeah, just simply a search.
The BBC thought there was some legitimate interest in covering the search of a well-known person. I was involved in another case called Operation Midland, where the police were investigating, believe it or not, the death of several young boys who were alleged to have been molested and killed. And those under suspicion were the former Prime Minister Ted Heath, my client, the former Home Secretary Leon Britton, although I was acting for his wife, who'd since died, and the Chief of the Defence Staff, Viscount Bramall. And they were all acting on the improbable allegation of a man who claimed to have been a witness and indeed victim himself of sexual abuse by these men and others, and that Heath and or Britain and or others had held a boy while he was stabbed and killed. And one of the police officers very unwisely made a statement to the press that this witness's evidence was credible. They deemed it to be credible. And a huge amount of money was spent on this investigation. One chief constable even standing outside Ted Heath's former house asking people to come forward and tell what they knew about this man. My client died, Leon Britton, and within weeks of his death, police turned up and where his widow was living, and were digging up the garden looking for bodies. I mean, it was ludicrous.
Outrageous.
The whole case was ridiculous.
Yeah.
But there's a huge amount of publicity to this, and therefore investigation, raids, no arrests or charges, and yet an enormous amount of publicity. And the campaign has now been started, which I strongly support, by the way, in that there is, unlike what the BBC was saying, there is no public interest at all in reporting whether or not a well-known person's house has been raided, or even actually if they've been arrested, because this is all on the basis of reasonable suspicion by police before any investigation has been commenced.
Yes.
And that there should be no coverage of these events unless and until that person is charged. You could say unless and until they've been convicted, but that would mean, I think, being completely unrealistic and not naming them during a trial. So unless until they're charged and the evidence has been considered from an investigation by trained lawyers according to the codes of practice, and they've decided that there is a reasonable prospect of conviction, nobody should suffer the stigma of publicity. And I very much hope that that will become the law. It should be the law, because otherwise people are going to be very unfairly branded. So that's where there is actually a police investigation. All the more so, therefore, surely we should be very cautious, even in social media, about how we cover allegations on Me Too, where people are coming forward and simply making bold assertions against people without ever reporting it to the authorities. So I think we're in a bit of a mess.
Yes.
I think we need to redress this, and it needs to be done and clearly understood by both the legislature, the media, and the authorities.
Yes. So there's two very distinct situations, it seems to me, listening to you, that need to be considered. The first is where, and it's where you started, by saying it's where a person claims to be a victim and speaks to the press. And that perhaps ought to be made the subject of criminal punishment, because, as you rightly point out, the only weapon that the person who is facing the allegation has at the moment to push back is defamation.
Yes.
And that's a blunt instrument in many ways.
And many people haven't got the money to do it.
To do it, and it's time consuming, and it amplifies the problem sometimes, because you go back into court and complaining about it. So that's a tricky one, isn't it? How to stop an individual going to the press, or to stop the press publicising individuals' allegations.
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I think it involves two things. One, certainly an awareness of what it is and the limits of what it is if somebody says that.
Yes.
And I'm totally against this cancel culture.
Yes.
I know there are going to be many people against me and saying, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong.
We'll get press on this one. I mean, people write in and tell us how wrong we are.
But I'm afraid the one thing that has driven me, and I know driven you during our professional careers, is that we're in this to try and ensure, so far as we can, fairness for our clients.
That's right.
And if you can't do that, then there's something wrong with the system.
Yeah.
And it just can't be right that you go and say what you like to the press, and there are consequences for those who you blame. It just can't be the case.
Yeah. And then, if I may interrupt again, if I may, there are two parts to this as well, aren't there? Because we talked about the press, and you have to define the press nowadays. So you've got the Times, the Guardian, the Daily Mail, and you've got social media, which is effectively today's press. I mean, apparently most people, the majority of people get their news now from Twitter and the like.
Yes.
Not the Times and the Telegraph.
Yes.
So how on earth you stop that is the big question.
I agree.
And then the second situation is
if
where,
there is a report to the authorities,
Mm-hmm.
at what stage does that become public?
That's part
and
two.
the kickback from that permitted to affect somebody who is a defendant.
And that's got a broader or a bigger issue involved in it, because most of this debate has come out of the Me Too investigations, which you will recall, and our listeners will recall, if they're English at least, came about because of Jimmy Savile.
Yes.
Jimmy Savile, for those that don't know, was a very well-known disc jockey and public figure, and he died with a good reputation, but after his death, all sorts of allegations surfaced.
Correct, and I'll just interpose there to say that I represented another well-known disc jockey
Yes.
in London who, for those of you who remember Capital Radio back in London, he was public, I'm not giving any confidences, his name was Dr. Fox.
Yes.
And very much, I believe, encouraged by this movement, a number of girls, by now young women, came forward and made allegations against him. One did. Then that arrest got publicity, and others came forward. And he
which, just interrupting, is of course one of the arguments for those that say there should be publicity.
It is.
Yeah.
I'll come back to that.
Yeah.
But in that instance, what I would suggest is that it shouldn't be the norm that police can simply say, "Oh well, we're publicising it because one others come forward." You ought to be able to go to a judge and get permission. I think the police ought to have to go to a judge and get permission.
There ought to be a filtering
system.
Yeah.
Anyway, that happened in this case without any such filtering system. And we ended up with a number of complaints of sexual touching, if you like, by him. And this was at the time when the Me Too movement was feverish and there was a lot of people, celebrities being arrested. Who's going to be arrested next?
Yes.
This man's been arrested. And well-known people were being arrested. And people couldn't get enough of it.
Extraordinary.
And so we decided we were not going to take this case to a jury trial in England, because we recognised that some jurors might actually not give our client the benefit of the doubt because this was such a feverish pitch. And we said, we'll in fact keep this, if we can, in the magistrates' court, which is the professional lower tier judiciary.
Mm.
And
this was a tactical decision made by the defence.
And we had three sober magistrates who listened to this trial, and he was triumphantly acquitted. Because what came out in this case was that all these complaints amounted to nothing, in effect.
Mm.
It's doubtful whether they were crimes. And in any event, the girls had all got together and gone on a weekend away and put their heads together. And this all came out in the trial. And the police were very anxious. In those days, you really couldn't get police to come and attend a domestic burglary. But if they were going to go and arrest somebody, a celebrity, you get about 6 or 8 of them willing to turn up and go and arrest him.
Yeah.
And the police were fascinated by celebrity. And therefore the police were sending messages to these girls in a way which...
Egging them on, effectively.
Well, I'm not quite going to say that for reasons of libel and other reasons.
Self-preservation.
But in any event, they did what they thought was appropriate.
Yeah.
We thought it wasn't appropriate.
Yeah.
And in the end he was acquitted. So, yes, I think you've got to be very careful that you don't get carried away here in the sweep of things. And, of course, we've seen how easy it is for people to make complaints a long time afterwards. Some people, it might unfairly be said, are doing this because they want to make money from publicity, or they're threatening civil proceedings and want to get money from the person they're alleging is responsible. But look, I'm sure there are many justifiable cases where allegations are made. All I'm saying is we've lost proportionality and we need to get it back. And we need to ensure that there is fairness on both sides. Very often we only hear the argument on one side and we lose it on behalf of those who are accused. I'm anxious that it's a fair playing field for everybody.
Yeah, well put. And this is largely a Hong Kong audience for our podcast, because we're a whole Hong Kong law firm, of course. And as I started at the beginning of this talk by saying, fortunately, we don't really have a Me Too movement here. I know it's because, I don't know, perhaps everyone's very well behaved in Hong Kong, or we've all got short memories. But one way or the other, it's a phenomenon that tends to have arisen in...
And in America.
And America.
Many other countries.
Yeah.
France.
Yeah. It's not an Asian thing. No, let's hope it stays that way, but that's been a fascinating insight, Jonathan, to the problem. And thank you very much for coming and talking about it.
My great
It's always good to see you.
Thank you.